Recording in progress. Here we go. Lesson three. Lesson three introduces the idea of what is called a Republican government. It's not Republican Party, it's just a style. And a lot of this idea of having a Republican style government is going to call back from an ancient civilization we call the Romans. Um, and I've got a lot of extra notes that I can give you in class about the Roman perspective of citizenship, because a lot of this, like civic virtue, um, that's one of those terms to understand, is going to come from a story about a Roman soldier. And I'm pretty sure this lesson covers that. So, lesson three. What is Republican government? This lesson introduces the ideas of Republican government, the common good, and civic virtue. These were ideas the founders learned from studying the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You will learn how these ideas shaped the founders' thinking about the kind of government they believed to be best. So, a few terms to understand here: aristocrats, civic virtue, common good, delegate, direct democracy, faction, representative, representative democracy, republic, and Republican government. Here we go. Yep, right from the jump, picture of Rome. What did the founders learn about government from the Romans? 2,000 years before our own nation began, there was a republic that greatly influenced the ideas of the founders. A republic is a country that has a government in which power is held by the people who elect representatives. That's the key thing. Rep. Republican government, representatives. Those representatives manage the government for the people for the sake of the common good. The government that fascinated the founders was the Roman Republic, which lasted nearly 500 years, from 509 BC to 27 BC. The capital of the Roman Republic was Rome, located in what today is Italy. The founders read what historians and the Romans themselves wrote about the people and government of the Roman Republic. The founders learned that during the Republic, the Roman people governed themselves without a king. In the Roman Republic, both the common people and the aristocrats, or wealthy upper class, shared the power to govern. The founders called the government of Rome a republican government. Republican government is a type of government in which the citizens have the power to govern, citizens delegate or entrust their power to leaders they elect to represent them and to serve their interests, and citizens and their representatives work cooperatively to promote the common good rather than their own interests. The term common good or common welfare means that which is good for the community as a whole. So, a few advantages. The founders thought a republican form of government was the best form of government they could create for themselves. They thought that they would have some of the same benefits that the ancient Romans had enjoyed. These are some of the benefits the founders saw in a republican government. One, representatives are elected to serve the common good. A representative is a person elected to act and speak for others. The main purpose of republican government is to serve the common good. Representatives should not make laws to serve the interests of one person or one group. The representatives make laws that serve the entire community. Number two, having representatives make the laws is more efficient. To make good and fair laws, you have to understand every problem well. But most people do not have time to learn about every problem. Representatives can create laws faster and better because it becomes their responsibility to do so. Number three, the people have a say in their government. By delegating power to their representatives, the people do not give up their voice in government. The people still have to decide who will represent them. The people have to communicate their ideas and the actions they want to take and they want taken to their representatives. And then finally, the representatives are responsible to the people. The people hold their representatives responsible for making good and fair laws. If the representatives do not make good and fair laws, the people can vote them out of office and select new leaders to represent them. And with any advantage, you have disadvantages. The founders worried about whether Republican government would work in the colonies. The founders saw that the Republican government as practiced in the Roman Republic had a few disadvantages. These are some of the possible disadvantages. Number one, Republican government works best in small communities. In small communities, the people know and care for each other and the common good. The colonies, on the other hand, occupied a large territory. Number two, the people in a republic have to be very much alike socially. The word socially is not in there, but it makes sense. There cannot be a high degree of diversity. The people cannot be very different in their wealth, moral beliefs, or ways of life. In the colonies, however, the people had many different religious beliefs and ways of life. So just think about that. You've got the urban people in the cities, you've got the rural folks farming on a farm, and getting people to agree on what's best between those two groups, not so good. You've got different religious conflicts as well. Gender as well too. People in a large and diverse republic would naturally divide into factions or interest groups. Such interest groups might work against other groups or the people as a whole, rather than work for the common good. How did the founders adapt the idea of Republican government? James Madison was one of the most important founders. We often call him the father of the Constitution because he played such an important role in creating our Constitution. Madison adapted the idea of Republican government to the reality of American life. Madison defined the difference between a direct democracy and Republican government in the following ways. One, in a direct democracy, the people themselves control government. The people create the laws they need. Direct democracy works best in small communities. As communities grow larger, it becomes difficult for people to make the decisions that are needed for the good of all. In a Republican government, the people's representatives make the laws and run government. This makes it possible for those in government to administer a much larger area. Madison believed that America could and should have a Republican form of government. Laws would be made and administered by representatives elected by the people. Madison said that members of government should be elected by a large number of the people rather than by a small number or a favored group. Such a government was a democracy in the sense that it received its right to govern from the people as a whole. This kind of government is now called a representative democracy. In a representative democracy, the people choose leaders to make and administer laws for their country. Madison also believed that you could organize a government in a way that might help avoid the abuse of power by one person or faction. Got a little bit of a what do you think there? And we will get into how to address the abuse of power in that next lesson. So civic virtue. Yes, the story of Cincinnatus. The idea of civic virtue was one of the most important parts of the classical Republican philosophy. It was the idea that citizens should put aside their own self-interests in favor of the common good of their communities and countries. The founders had read about the famous Roman leader, Cincinnatus, who they believed was a model of civic virtue. In the year 460 BC, Rome was in a great danger. An army from the east was burning and plundering the countryside. The enemy surrounded the defending Roman army on all sides. The leaders of the government of Rome decided to ask Cincinnatus, a skilled military leader, to help them during this crisis. The government leaders sent messengers asking Cincinnatus to serve as dictator of the country for as long as the crisis might last. Cincinnatus was a hardworking farmer with only 4 acres of land. When the messengers found him, he was quietly plowing the fields. Because he loved his country, he left his plow to go to Rome to lead the army. In a battle that lasted 2 days, his army defeated the enemy and saved the country. In gratitude, the people of Rome honored and praised Cincinnatus. But when the crisis was over, Cincinnatus did not try to remain as dictator of his country. He did not want continued power. Instead, he returned to his home and his life as a farmer and a citizen. By returning to his home, Cincinnatus showed that he valued being a good citizen of Rome more than he valued fame and personal power. He respected the government of Rome. He did not want to use his popularity to take power away from the representatives elected by the citizens. Now, that story of Cincinnatus is going to pop up again in our government's history. One person that you can easily see the comparison to Cincinnatus is George Washington. George Washington, skilled military leader. He was the important figure that rose to prominence during the French and Indian War. And when our country got started off, and after the Constitution was drawn up, there were a lot of people that wanted to lead, but one guy that was just like wanting to make money on his farm was George Washington. Well, George Washington was asked to lead. He's like, okay, fine. And he ran unopposed in this first term. And then after his first term, they asked him to go another one. And after his second term, they wanted him to go a third term, but he left after 2. And that's how presidents acted for a long time, until a little president known as FDR, who was elected to 4 terms. Yeah, 4. He was elected to as president 4 times. And after, like, people noticed, oh crap, wow, if people want to stay in power, they're going to stay in power. And then we changed the Constitution where you can only run for president and get elected twice, 2 terms. So even if you're a great leader, you got to step away. So why is that? We don't want to have people abuse power. Why is civic virtue necessary for Republican government to work well? The founders thought that the Republican government was possible in Rome only because of the high degree of civic virtue of Roman citizens. Civic virtue meant that both citizens and their leaders set aside their private interests and personal concerns for the common good. In the Roman Republic, the responsibilities or duties of citizens were emphasized as more important than their personal rights. When a conflict between one's personal rights and interests in the common good arose, citizens were expected to set aside their interests in favor of the common good. The founders thought that civic virtue was important to make a government work well. Citizens need to participate in their government to promote the common good. Citizens were expected to be well informed and to participate in community affairs. Citizens did have political rights, such as the right to vote, to express their opinions about government, and to serve in public office. But there were often limits on other rights, such as privacy or freedom of conscience or religion. Madison understood the importance of civic virtue to good government. In this way, he was like the other founders. Madison also accepted John Locke's view of human nature. He believed that people often act in their self-interest. He thought that the pursuit of self-interest could, in its own way, further the common good. For example, a statesman's desire for fame and the admiration of others could lead him or her to practice civic virtue. He also believed that the common good could be served by individuals pursuing their economic self-interest. Each would contribute to the general prosperity, which served the common good. Madison also realized that as people pursue their own interests, they sometimes act against the interests of the common good. He knew that civic virtue alone could not be relied upon to ensure a good government that promoted the common good. Madison wanted to create a government that would fit human nature as it is, not as one might wish it to be. So, again, this whole Republican government lesson is a really good thing to be thinking about as you move throughout your life. There's going to be people that pop up that want to become famous and powerful, and they'll do that through becoming elected officials. And it's always interesting to see what actually happens when people get that kind of power. Do they abuse it? Do they act within the power that we give them once they're in that position? So, how did the colonists teach the values of Republican government? People living in the American colonies were taught the value of civic virtue and other values of Republican government in many ways. Parents taught these values to their children, teachers taught them in school, clergy taught them in sermons and writings. Leading citizens of the country were expected to set good examples. The values of Republican government were a part of the customs and traditions of the people. The ideas and values of the Roman Republic were promoted throughout the American colonies in the stories that people read. Public buildings designed to resemble the buildings of ancient Rome also reminded people of the ideas and values of the Roman Republic. The founders thought it was important to teach and promote civic virtue among citizens. They believed that the Roman Republic had failed in the end because its citizens lost their civic virtue. They had promoted their own interests at the expense of the common good. By the time of the American Revolution, the founders had come to believe strongly in the ideals of Republican government. They thought that Great Britain was violating these ideals. They claimed the British government was guilty of serving selfish interests at the expense of the common good. It had violated those rights that good government was supposed to protect. After the revolution, the founders were able to establish their own government. They tried to make sure this government would not violate the people's rights. An essential step, they thought, was to create a constitutional government. You will learn what a constitution and a constitutional government are in the next lesson. Yes, Republican government. Think about this. We agree to be governed. That's a social contract, right? Now, once we agree to be governed, do we have time to create all the rules? No, no, we don't. All of you have your own interests at heart. Some of you, like, just think about what you want to do when you grow up. What's your life's pathways? What job do you want? How do you want to live your life, your lifestyle, your family? Taking part in communal events, churches, organizations, that sort of thing. You don't have time to create these rules. So what we will do, we will elect people that want to run. Nobody forces anybody to run for president, governor, or mayor. They have to want it. So they have to have a self-interest in it, right? Okay. If they do well, we want to keep them in. If they don't do well for you, you get them out. And what you think is important, you have to have your own opinions. And more than likely, you're going to agree with a lot of other people if a leader is doing well or they're not. And there's going to be a debate there. So by having open and free elections where we elect representatives, Republican government. Now, there is still a democratic part in there too, because individuals get to vote on it, hence the term representative democracy. But with that being said, and it'll get to the next lesson, what happens when people become abusive of that power? You give them power, sometimes they take it too far. Next lesson. See you.